You are now listening to the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. All right, guys, welcome to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. Lawrence Reed is the president emeritus of the Foundation for Economic Education and has been writing and speaking for the organization since the late 1970s. He taught economics at Northwood University in Michigan and has authored nearly 2,000 columns and articles. He has authored or co-authored 8 books, including his 2020 book, Was Jesus a Socialist? He has a recent piece out for the Foundation of Economic Education called Jesus Would Support Student Debt Forgiveness, Not So Fast, which we'll be discussing on the show today. Larry, welcome to the Protestant Libertarian Podcast.
Hey, thank you so much, Alex, for having me. I really appreciate it and look forward to our discussion.
Oh, it's going to be great. The piece is incredible. But before we do that, I was reading your bio, and you have been teaching and researching and writing about economics for a really long time. So before we get in the show today, tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, and then your work for the Foundation of Economic Education.
Okay. Well, I'm a Pennsylvanian by birth, lived there my first 23 years, and then moved to Michigan, where I lived for 31 years. And during that time, I chaired a Department of Economics at Northwood University, where I taught, and also was the first president of the Mackinac Center for Public Policy in Midland, Michigan. I also lived for a couple of years in Idaho, where I ran a think tank. And in 2008, I retired from the Mackinac Center in Michigan to take the position of president of the Foundation for Economic Education. And I held that position for 11 years and retired to the emeritus role in 2019, which means I get to do what I most enjoy, which is writing and speaking.
Yeah, that's great. And what made you interested in kind of exploring the intersection between economics and theology?
This was a topic, Alex, that I have had an interest in as long as I can remember. I think even as a high school student, I had an interest in this because my mother in particular made sure that we went to church most Sundays. And so I had to think about theological matters at a rather early age. And once I became interested in ideas of individual liberty and free markets, I looked for compatibilities or incompatibilities between those ideas and the teachings of Jesus. And I began to see a lot of people making the claim that Jesus was a socialist in some way, that he would support all sorts of expansion of government into our lives. And I couldn't square that with either my understanding of economics or the teachings of Jesus as I knew them. And so I wrote, I think, for the first time on this topic as a college student. And then it sort of simmered for decades until in recent years when I saw a big increase in the claims that Jesus was a socialist. And that's when I decided, hey, I've got to weigh into this in some way. So I wrote first an essay titled, Was Jesus a Socialist? And then expanded it a couple of years later into a full-blown book. And it came out in 2020.
All right. That sounds great. Well, before we begin to talk about your article today, could you kind of give us the background about the Biden administration's plans to cancel student loan forgiveness? Why do you think that they announced it at this time? And what do you think the Biden administration's intended goal is or intended effect is with announcing that?
Well, they may still alter it in some way. And in fact, there's a chance it might even never take effect if the courts were to rule it out. But so far, the Biden administration is talking about taking those with student debt who have incomes of $125,000 or less and forgiving between $10,000 and $20,000 of that debt per student, depending upon whether you have a Pell Grant or not. So that number could vary. Those are the broad outlines of what they're talking about. This has been stewing within the Biden administration for quite some time and was alluded to by his campaign and Democratic officials during the campaign of 2020. So it isn't a sudden thing, but I think they decided early to time it in such a way as to maximize the political advantage from it. And which I think is really rather shameful. This is one of the endless reasons why I think the welfare state is very problematic. One of them is that it's used in a cynical way by politicians to buy votes from people by
Yeah.
dangling things in front of them that they get from somebody else. And so Biden, I'm sure, decided, hey, let's put this off until shortly before the election when we need young people to show up because they're easily bought and paid for. We'll buy their votes by
Right.
giving them some handout. So I think that was the reasoning behind it. Very cynical and I think shameful.
Yeah, and that was kind of my thought too, that this was timed deliberately because I think that going into the upcoming election, the Biden administration is going to really struggle, and it looks like they're going to lose the House and maybe even the Senate as well. And it just kind of felt like the timing of announcing this created a lot of controversy when the Democrats needed a little boost for their poll numbers.
Yeah, I think so. And then, of course, the administration isn't even attempting to go through Congress. It never
Yeah.
submitted a proposal for Congress to deliberate over and to enact and for the president to sign. He's proposing to do it simply by executive order. And it's very problematic as to whether or not that is constitutional, whether he has the power to do it. I hope the courts rule that he doesn't,
Yeah.
because, in effect, what he's doing is saying we're going to transfer debts from one group of people to another group of people, from student creditors or borrowers rather, to taxpayers. And for a president to have the power to do that simply by decree to the tune of $500 billion or more is really not a power that any one man should ever have.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I've been very shocked with the response that a lot of Christians have had to the student loan forgiveness. And I live in Kentucky, so it's a pretty conservative state. And most of the people that I know here were against the policy from the beginning. But I recently got on Twitter because of the show and seeing the response of a lot of Christian thought leaders to those of us that might think that this is a bad idea on economic grounds has been really eye-opening. And I guess that was kind of the thesis of the piece in Time magazine that your article critiques. Would you mind walking us through what the arguments that the writers of that article for Time were making?
I'd be happy to. This argument was made in this Time magazine article that was co-authored by two people about a month ago, maybe a little less. And they were essentially saying that Jesus asked people, his disciples in particular, to pray for debt forgiveness. And they were citing, of course, a passage in Matthew in the Sermon on the Mount where Jesus says, forgive us our debts as we forget our debtors. At least that's the way they read that passage. I think that's not a literal translation. And so they kind of ballooned that into this notion that Jesus would support the Biden administration's student debt forgiveness, as if what Jesus was talking about had anything to do with student loans or car payments or mortgage payments. I mean, you fill in the blank. I guess their argument you could apply to any kind of debt because they're referring to passages that don't single out any particular kind of debt. So let's just cancel all debts, or
Yeah.
and worry about the economic consequences later.
Yeah. All right. And so what prompted you to write a response to that piece in particular?
Well, I've become very sensitive over the years, especially since my book, Was Jesus a Socialist, came out, to these false claims that Jesus would endorse this or that, especially when this or that is some expansion of government into our lives. Because in every case that I can think of in recent months and years, this is a fiction. This is the attempt by some people with a political agenda to sort of shoehorn Jesus into their plans. And I think that's, at the very least, shameful, probably blasphemous. And so when I see something so inaccurate and so twisted, so distorted, so intended to make people think one thing, even though biblical truth is in another direction, I feel called to respond to it.
Yeah. One of the things that's really interesting to me, well, number one, I used to be a subscriber to Time Magazine like a long time ago, and I canceled my subscription. I don't know. I think during the 2016 election because I couldn't take it anymore. But my assumption about the perspective of Time Magazine towards evangelical Christianity, I guess American Christianity in general, is that they didn't like it and they wanted to disassociate themselves with it as much as possible. So, do you think that them writing an article making the claim that Jesus would have supported student loan forgiveness is just kind of pure cynical politics on their part?
Oh, I'm sure it is, because Time has built such a reputation in recent decades on the very far left of the political and economic spectrum. So this fit their narrative that they've been promoting for years. It colors every issue of the magazine. Now, the two co-authors were not full-time Time Magazine
Okay.
employees, but I'm sure that the folks at Time were more than happy to run something like this, and probably will not run something that explains why those authors got it wrong. That's pretty much par for the course at Time Magazine.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with that. And what's really interesting about Time Magazine is I think I started subscribing to it like my freshman year of college. So it was like 2007, 2008. And I remember that they used to run pieces by people that consider themselves to be capitalists back then. So they would at least allow the other side of the argument to have some space in the pages of their magazine. Why do you think they've turned their back on that completely? And it seems like the mainstream media in general has become entirely anti-free market over the last few years.
Yeah, the mainstream media or the legacy media has certainly taken on a very left-wing cast, and it's part and parcel of the left-wing socialist-leaning philosophy to be intolerant. I mean, after all, it's a philosophy that whose prescriptions are laden with calls for force. Socialism and those isms of the left are never voluntary. They don't have a laundry list of suggested tips, for good living. I mean, they have a laundry list of programs they are so confident in they want to foist them and force them upon people, and they don't like criticism. I mean, the whole politically correct movement, the cancel culture stuff—it's all from the left. They are very intolerant people. So. To run one side and not the other fits really in their way of thinking and their political agenda. So I'm not surprised. As I say, it's become
Yeah.
par for the course. One side, and they ignore the other side almost completely.
Yeah. Well, that makes a lot of sense. Well, in the article that was written in Time Magazine, they appealed to two passages in particular. You referred to one, which was Matthew 6:14, and then the other one was in the book of Leviticus 25. So I want to kind of take those in turn. So let's go over how they got these two passages wrong. So I want to start with Matthew 6:14. If you could maybe explain the context of Matthew 6:14, and then explain how the authors of the Time piece misunderstood that when applying it to the student debt relief policy.
Okay. Yeah, Matthew 6:14 is from the Sermon on the Mount, where I think which is the longest continuous passage of words of Jesus in the New Testament. And in that passage, the authors say that he said, "Forgive our debts as we forgive our debtors." And that is not an uncommon translation, but it's technically not right. It's more accurate to say that what Jesus was really saying was, "Forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us." In other words, what's at issue here is sin. Jesus was saying that each of us should pray to God to ask for forgiveness for our sins. And then, just as we expect him to then forgive us of those sins, we should have a forgiving spirit towards those who have sinned against us. There's no mention in that of transference of debt. It is a very personal thing that Jesus is talking about here. It's you asking God for forgiveness of your sins, and it's you forgiving another person who has sinned against you. There's no suggestion that, hey, let's take the sin and transfer it and burden somebody else with it. which is what Biden's debt forgiveness plan would do. It says to the student borrower, we're going to forgive some of your loan, but then we're going to make the taxpayer pay for it, an unwitting and unwilling third party. That's not what Jesus was talking about at all.
Right. Yeah. And that's you make the claim in your piece. And I want to make sure that I get the phraseology right here. But you make the argument that debt forgiveness involves forcing innocent bystanders to pay for the debts of other people. And you make the argument that that runs completely contrary to all of the principles that Jesus lays out in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew.
Oh, absolutely. As I point out in Was Jesus a Socialist? He taught the ethics of things like honesty, sanctity of contract, private property, honoring your word, responsibility. He never said, thou shalt take your debt and throw it onto somebody else and force them to pay it. He never said, thou shalt trust the politicians to do that dirty business for you. Nothing like that. This was all cooked up, those who try to proclaim that Jesus would support this debt forgiveness. Because what Biden is doing is not just canceling a debt between a lender and a borrower. He's saying to lenders, or to borrowers, we're going to take some of your debt and we're going to put it on the shoulders of a whole lot of other people, taxpayers, because now that the borrowers won't be paying that, then federal spending must go up, or the federal deficit rises. And when that happens, of course, it puts pressure on the Federal Reserve to accommodate the gap by printing money. So one way or the other, taxpayers are going to pay for this, either in higher taxes or inflation or both.
So there are some people that would say that Jesus commands us to be merciful and kind to other people. And so I think that's been the number one argument that I've seen in favor of student debt relief by Christians online. How would you respond to that argument? That, okay, yes, we're acknowledging that the government is taking money from people that don't have student debts and transferring it in some way to people that do have student debts. But as Christians, we should be thankful or supportive of that. What's wrong with that argument?
Well, Jesus certainly urged us to practice such qualities as compassion, thoughtfulness towards others, assistance to people in genuine need, but he also expected some responsibility in return. He never said, if you voluntarily agree to borrow from X, and later it's perfectly okay if Y enters the picture and cancels it for you and transfers the burden to Z. That's totally different from what Jesus was talking about. And so, you and I, as taxpayers and as consumers, will bear this burden in taxes and inflation, but yet we weren't personally asked. Nobody Joe Biden didn't come and say, would you voluntarily agree to forgive that debt for this particular person? We're never asked that. This is just an arbitrary act by a politician trying to buy votes and foisting a new obligation, a new burden on people who never were asked and weren't obligated in any way to make good on this. What about the people who initially agreed to take on this debt? Why are we saying you don't have to keep your word now? What about the people who chose to avoid debt and either not go to college or to work during their college years, or, to find alternatives to incurring debt in order to secure the education they wanted? What about them? They look like suckers in this whole thing.
Yeah. Yeah. And I know, for me, this is kind of embarrassing to admit to somebody who's been studying economics for longer than I've been alive, but I didn't actually take an economics course until I was in graduate school. And it was 2016 when I took my first ever class in economics. And so before then, I couldn't tell you the definition of capitalism or socialism. And I just kind of assumed, because of, the environment in which I was raised, that Jesus would have been a socialist had he lived in the modern world. Why do you think so many American Christians in particular make that assumption about Jesus?
Several reasons, Alex. I think one is that many Christians have a mistaken understanding of what socialism is. they think that it's what socialists like you to believe that it is. So it's just compassion, it's people sharing things, it's people doing good things through government for other people. It's all happy face, smiles, and doing good for each other. But socialism, of course, is not just those things. It's not just sharing and giving and caring and compassion. In fact, there's more sharing and caring and giving and compassion under capitalism, where you have the means to produce the stuff to help others with, than you ever have under socialist systems. Just look at the flow of foreign aid that goes between governments. It's almost exclusively from governments of countries that are largely capitalist to governments of countries that are largely socialist, because it's the socialist countries that have the problems. They can't feed themselves and make war on producers and then wonder why their economy doesn't produce. So it's ridiculous. Socialism is not those things. It is, in a word, force. What makes socialism socialism is that it deploys force to achieve its objectives. It's not voluntary. This is so endemic, so descriptive of, so definitional of socialism, that I would go so far as to say that if it's voluntary, it's not socialism, because you can do that under capitalism. Socialism is the use of force. And then the question is, well, for what purpose? And socialists will vary one to another in terms of the purposes that they may personally put a priority on, but they all believe to some degree or another in using political power, force of government, to centrally plan an economy, or to appropriate the means of production, property of others, or to redistribute wealth from some to others, robbing Peter to pay Paul. And there is no evidence in the Bible whatsoever, especially in the words of Jesus, that would endorse any of those objectives, let alone the use of force to achieve them. Not a word. There's no place where Jesus says it's okay to call upon politicians to steal and give to certain favored constituencies. Nothing whatever. He was interested in what's in your heart, not in what's in your bank account. And one final point on this. Some people will say, well, but didn't he say a lot of things about why we should care for the poor? Well, yeah, he did. But he didn't mean by that you should foist that upon taxpayers, or that the politicians should do it. If he came back today and spoke to a large audience, and if he said to that audience, well, I said to look after the poor, certainly the deserving poor in any event, and now tell me what you did in that regard. And if you raised your hand and said, oh, Lord, here's what I did. I just voted for the politicians who said they'd take care of it. You think Jesus would say, oh, well done, thy good and faithful servant? No, he would say, what? That's not what I meant. I didn't say let the politicians do it. I was interested in what you would do with your money, not what you might do with somebody else's money. That doesn't tell me what's in your heart. So there's just a lot of misunderstanding about what socialism is all about.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I've felt, at least since I began to study economics, that expecting the government to take care of social problems that the Bible explicitly gives to the church is kind of like an abrogation of our responsibility. Like, it's supposed to be us that's out there doing that, taking care of the people that are in need, not the government. Do you think that it's because they don't teach economics in public schools, or why is it that so many people are just economically illiterate?
Well, a lot of reasons. About a century ago, or actually a little longer, there was in academia, in the intelligentsia, you might say, people who traffic in ideas and think about things deeply. There was a new trend that took root and has done a lot of damage in the years that it's built ever since. And that is the idea of moral relativism, that there are no moral absolutes, that truth is, who knows what it is. It differs from one person to another and that kind of stuff. And once you start down that path, you're vulnerable to all kinds of bad thinking. If you feel as though you're not going to be accountable in later in an afterlife or what you do, well, chances are you'll do more things than you would want to try to get away with if you had to worry about that. So those are destructive trends and ideas that took root more than a century ago, and that's part of the problem. But you hinted at another aspect, and that is the understanding of economics and the teaching of it is just woeful in K-12 schools. And that's because it's woeful in the schools of education that train the teachers. It's not taught there, or to the extent it is, it's full of myths and misconceptions. Things like, oh, when the government spends, it creates new wealth, or that it's actually free if it comes from the government, or rich people are to be vilified and demonized and taken from so we can do good things with their money. Those destructive ideas are widely taught in the schools of education, even many schools of economics and political science. And so our teachers pick up on that, and many of them don't intend to preach a political agenda, but they're doing it whether they realize it or not, because that's the monopolistic vision of the world that they got in grad school.
Yeah, it's just they literally don't know any better.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's it's unfortunate. It really is. What the other passage that they turn to in that Times article that I want to talk about here for a little bit is Leviticus 25. And so Leviticus 25 outlines the year of Jubilee. Would you mind explaining the background of that passage too?
That's right. Yes, I would be happy to. Leviticus 25 of the Old Testament talks about the year of Jubilee, which was to occur every 50 years. And this is within ancient Israel. Even if you misinterpret what it really was, it's still quite a leap to say that there was some sort of universal commandment for all people for all time to do this sort of thing. It was intended for ancient Israelites. The notion here was that every 50 years there would be a payoff of debts. Now, that's different from a cancellation of debts. Some people, in fact, a great many people, Christians as well, they think that the Jubilee meant that, every home mortgage, every debt of any kind, your car payments, if we lived to the standards of the Jubilee practice, would be just wiped away every 50 years. And of course, you have to ask yourself, if that were the case, who would ever lend in the first place? Or certainly, if you would lend, you would take into account under the terms of the loan that when the Jubilee year rolled around, that whatever was left of the debt was going to go to zero, and you're going to be holding the bag. So it would cause havoc in the capital market for sure. Nobody's going to lend if they think that their debt's going to be arbitrarily canceled. But what, in fact, the Jubilee really was something very different. It's more analogous to the payoff of a lease. And there was no redistribution, certainly no forcible redistribution as a result of it. Let's say we're in year 45, 5 years before the Jubilee. Its practice would suggest that, okay, if you're a farmer and you would like to take out a loan based on forthcoming crops over the next 5 years before Jubilee, well, then the lender would say, okay, how much do you want? Let's say you say $50,000 a year. I know I can pay that back out of my forthcoming crops over the next 5 years. So total loan is $250,000. You get it. So you farm for the next 5 years. Each year out of your crops, you pay back $50,000 of it. Jubilee year rolls around, and as expected, the debt is paid off. Not canceled, but paid off. That's very different from what Biden is trying to do with student loans, which is to arbitrarily and unexpectedly cancel an incurred debt and foist the burden of it onto unwilling others.
Yeah. Well, and then I want to get, I mean, I think that's perfect. And I want to kind of get to maybe some of the bigger ways in which our society understands Leviticus. One of the really interesting things about the timepiece is that I remember in 2015 when the Supreme Court made the decision to legalize gay marriage across the United States, that there were a lot of people that argued against including anything from Leviticus in the argument because they looked at Leviticus 18 that has all of those prescriptions against certain kinds of sexual behavior. And they said, look, this is completely illegitimate. Like we should have nothing to do with this text whatsoever. It shouldn't even enter the conversation. Why do you think that we're okay with using Leviticus 25 when it comes to paying off student loans, but then we're also not okay with applying Leviticus 18 when it comes to modern sexual practices?
Yeah, very good point. Of course, people who cherry pick biblical passages to suit their political agendas of today, you have to wonder, well, what are they committed to first and foremost? Is it biblical teaching or is it their political agenda? And I think for the most part, it tends to be the political agenda that takes precedence. Certainly if you're cherry picking, then that suggests that you're not all that interested in what the Bible wants you to do. You're more interested in using it to advance your particular agenda. And as a Christian, I look back on the Old Testament and I say it has immense teaching value. It certainly, in its prophecies and numerous other passages, points in the direction of what was to come, the coming of Jesus and salvation through him. But the coming of Jesus meant that there was a new covenant. And Jesus did not disdain or throw out Old Testament practices. He just said, for many of them apply to the time and place and people that, who were living under it. But now I'm here, and the covenant with people is of a different nature. Otherwise, I mean, you'd have to take so many old practices like animal sacrifice or what have you, and start applying them to daily life today. But they don't apply. I mean, the Old Testament is full of prescriptions for what the Holy of Holies in the temple should look like, and how many candles should be here, and so forth. That's fine for its time and day, but again, that's the Old Testament. It's not the new one, and we shouldn't be cherry picking from either Old or New Testament to satisfy our political agendas.
Yeah, especially when it comes to issues that are as complicated as economics too. Yeah. And again, I'm with you on that completely. And that was one of the things that I appreciated about you drawing out in your article, was that it is very inconsistent to just try to handpick certain passages in the Bible that support your pre-existing political commitments. It's just not a good way to approach the scripture.
Yeah, that's right. And reading into an ancient passage, something that is then made into some universal for all time commandment, is a very tricky thing. There are some things like the Ten Commandments, which Jesus himself reinforced that you do that with because they're meant to be universal. But things like animal sacrifice and stoning of criminals and so forth, those were meant for a different time.
Yeah, and it's truly amazing how quickly people will grasp onto the things that they value and use the Bible to justify them, and then ignore all the passages that contradict their previously held beliefs. So that's really great. One of the things that I want to spend a little bit of time on today is that, because I think for me too, I've been reading a lot of economics over the last couple of years, and so I've been thinking through a lot of the mechanics of a market economy and things like that. And so I really like that you brought up a couple of really important issues, economic issues, at the end of your article. So I want to talk kind of about the mechanics of student debt forgiveness. One of the claims that was made in the Times article was that this policy was going to benefit the poor. Now, I don't know about where you live, but where I live, $125,000 a year is an awful lot of money. I'm a public school teacher. That's way more than I'm ever going to make, right? And so, who are the real beneficiaries of this public student loan debt relief? Is it the poor people, as they claimed in the article, or who benefits from this?
It's going to disproportionately help the better off among us, if I could use that very broad generality, and for a number of reasons. One, poor people don't go to college in the same proportion or numbers that wealthier people do. And even though the Biden administration said, well, we're going to limit this to students whose incomes are 125,000 or less, keep in mind that what if you just completed college a very few years ago and you earned a medical degree? Maybe right now your income is only 125,000, but the reason you invested in a degree, medical degree, was that you expected over your lifetime you would earn considerable money, enough to pay off the debt and then some. So what might that person be earning in 5 or 10 or 20 years? If they made a good investment in the right degree and use it properly, they might be at $1 million in another 5 years. Well, we've just forgiven their debt by foisting it on the average taxpayer who makes a lot less.
Yeah. And what's the problem? I guess because I really do think that there is a kind of a spiritual element to this problem of middle class to upper middle class people holding on to this debt for years and years and years, and then being thankful that the government is going to step in and pay this debt off for them. Like what are some of the spiritual problems that arise from that mentality?
Well, it's corrupting spiritually, I think, because it causes people to sort of look to the government and express gratitude to government as if it was government that did something good for them. All the government did was transfer their debt onto other people. What's so good about that? Are we so blind as to ignore the impact of this measure on our brothers and sisters? Do we just say, hey, the only thing that matters to me is that I get something, and if somebody else gets the bill, what do I care? I mean, that's not a very Christian attitude to take. So it's corrupting in that sense. And it also is corrupting to those who are not on the receiving end. People who worked hard, who avoided debt, who went in another direction other than an expensive college degree. We want to encourage the kind of virtues and values that played into the decisions they made. But this debt forgiveness basically says, sorry, you were kind of a sucker. You should have gone into debt because now you'd be forgiven a portion of it. So you made the bad decision to work during college or pursue another path. And I'm very concerned about what that kind of thing does to incentives in society. It says to the hardworking, debt-avoiding people, you're suckers, but the other people who may not be of those same virtues, it basically says, we'll bail you out. And I don't think a Christian people who believe in sticking to your word should ever be happy about that. And we really ought to search our souls and ask ourselves, do I really want to be bought and paid for? Am I so cheap that I will praise the politicians when they give me something from other people? Don't be so easily purchased by politicians.
And one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot with regards to this issue too is that there's obviously a difference between capitalism and consumerism, and I think a lot of people have been taught to conflate those two terms. All that capitalism is, as you mentioned, is the private ownership of the means of production and decentralized economic decision making, whereas consumerism, from a Christian standpoint, is organizing your life around the acquisition of more and more material goods, which is, I think, a really big spiritual problem. And one of the aspects of the student debt relief forgiveness that I find really problematic from a Christian perspective is that it encourages people who have voluntarily incurred these debts. They should be deferring spending on other, consumer goods and paying off their debts before doing so, when in reality, having these indefinite debts with the possibility they might get paid off by the government later on actually encourages people to be more materialistic and more consumeristic, because they're not going to pay off debts that they voluntarily incurred. Instead, they're going to spend their money on other things that make them happy. Do you think that there's something to that?
Oh, I totally do. Absolutely. All the incentives of this arbitrary debt forgiveness really are in the wrong direction. It may even encourage the future students to consider more favorably going into debt, because they might think that, we can form a political pressure group or a lobby, and at some point we'll get some forgiveness. They've just done it, so we can claim that we're owed it too. So it lowers the cost of incurring debt because of the hope that you may be let off the hook. And I don't think that's a positive thing for any free and prosperous society to consider.
Right. So we've made the determination here that this is going to primarily benefit, well, one, the politicians. Those are the people that always benefit from these policies first. And I think a lot of people are just not aware of how messed up that system is. But then also more well-to-do people, because in general, they're going to go to school, they're going to take out student loans, and they're going to have the higher paying jobs. Who does this hurt the most?
I think in the long run, it hurts American taxpayers. We're already burdened by something approaching or maybe even now exceeding the highest portion the government has claimed of our economy in our history. And we're not even at war. And now we're about to pile on a $500 billion additional burden. So whether as taxpayers or as consumers who will pay a price in inflation, it's everyday Americans. I mean, the wealthy always find a way to get around or to mitigate the impositions and burdens of government. Not entirely. I mean, we put some of those people out of business because of what government does to them. But by and large, they'll get by. But the average American and low-income Americans in particular, they're always on the edge, and we're just now piling on another burden. And I just have to ask, when does this stop? Do we just do it for every seemingly worthwhile cause that somebody can cook up? Somebody who wants to win an election, so they say, well, let's give this or that constituency a handout. Where does that end? I can tell you where it ended for the old Roman Republic. It ended in bankruptcy, dictatorship, and the disappearance from the pages of history. So I hope we're not on that path, but that's where we're headed.
Yeah. One of the points that they made in the timepiece that I thought was really interesting, because I agree with it in part, was that these student loans are often incurred by the people that take these loans through loans that are particularly predatory. Like the entire student loan industry is a predatory industry. Do you agree with that statement?
Oh, I'm sure that over the years, there have been some lenders in that market who could be described as predatory, or they weren't honest in the terms that they laid out. And where that's the case, then you have an argument for an aggrieved party, a student, to prove it in court and get redress of grievances. But I think the biggest predatory lender in the student debt market has been government itself. By encouraging students, irrespective of what majors they choose and whether or not there are jobs related to them, encouraging students by subsidizing loans to incur this debt, to not look at things in a realistic economic way because they're artificially made cheap by government subsidy. We should not underestimate the massive degree to which government has misdirected resources and ruined the signals that markets would normally send to students as to what's worthwhile and what isn't.
Right.
If you had to pay a market rate for a student loan instead of a subsidized one, you might say, maybe I'll switch from gender studies to engineering, where the jobs are. But if we just say, no, it doesn't matter, we'll subsidize you even if you major in something for which there are no jobs, I think that sends all the wrong signals.
Yeah, and that was a point that I think a lot of people don't truly grasp and appreciate, is that almost all student loans are subsidized by the federal government. Can you talk about how that happens? Like what mechanisms do the federal government use to ensure that these loans that are given out by on paper private businesses to these lenders, how does the government back those loans up?
Well, I know it's changed since the Obama years because I remember a lot of fellow students at the time I went to college, and I think this was true for a long time, the lenders were private, but the government guaranteed the loan. And in that way, and in perhaps other ways, made it possible for the interest rate to be considerably lower than would otherwise be the case. But now, since Obama, I think the lending has been more direct from the government itself. I'm not a student of that market, so I don't know the details very much, but I know the government's much more involved in it today than it was as recently as a decade ago.
Yeah. And there are a lot of economists that have made the argument that it is that system of loans that actually increases the cost of college. And I think that's hard for a lot of people to understand. Could you explain how that works too?
Yeah, anytime you pour more gas on a fire, the fire is going to get bigger. Um, and that's essentially what government has done by coming in and saying, oh, college is so important. We think just about everybody ought to go. And so we're going to throw a lot of money at it. Well, what happens is that bids up the cost of college. And especially if colleges and universities realize that, hey, the government's going to be more generous next year to students in its lending, so we can jack up tuition. The students won't feel it because the government's going to give them more money. So we have fed college and university bureaucracies and all kinds of silly politically correct fantasies by artificially subsidizing the cost of college through these student loans. So it's a very unrealistic market. There's a lot that goes on at colleges and universities that just wouldn't happen if those things had to pay for themselves, if they had to prove themselves in the marketplace. And there are a lot of people employed at universities who would probably not know what to do if the government didn't directly or indirectly subsidize them to do their thing at colleges and universities. And that's not a universally good thing. It's mostly a bad thing because we subsidize a lot of bad behavior in the process.
Is there a relationship between the fact that a lot of economics professors at the public school level are socialists and these student loan policies that are being pushed by the federal government?
Let me put it this way. If you are a government employee teaching economics at a government university, your bread and butter comes from the government, and chances are pretty good that you're going to say, we ought to have more government. Surprise, surprise. I mean, if the left is always saying, oh, you work for a private company or a private foundation, therefore your views must be skewed by the private profit motivated interests of those people. Why they don't see that as a problem in government, I don't know. But yeah, of course. In fact, one of the reasons that you see the rise of think tanks, independent, privately funded, in many cases, think tanks in recent decades, I've run several of them, is because the universities stopped providing an alternative perspective. And whenever university employees said something about government policy, it was usually to endorse it or support it or call for more of it. How often do you see a study from a university economics department that says, here are all the ways in which our state government or our federal government could and should reduce spending? No, they never do that.
Right.
They'd be cutting off the nose to spite their face. That has to be done by independent entities because these other folks are essentially bought and paid for.
Right. Well, and that's one of the points that Ludwig von Mises makes over and over again in his work is that, these like in capitalism, businesses actually have to provide for the needs of the consumer in order to stay alive. And if they fail to meet consumer needs, then those businesses will go under and all of the capital that was invested in that company will be allocated elsewhere. Whereas these public schools don't have that incentive at all. And it's really funny to me that we have, millions of people in the United States that have gone to these public higher education institutions and they come out with a lot of debt and a low paying job, and they don't realize that they did not get the thing that they went to college to get. And instead of blaming it on college, I guess they're going to blame it on society and capitalism and all that kind of stuff. It just doesn't make any sense to me.
No, it doesn't. And it's not the adult way to behave. Adults do not point fingers trying to foist upon others the blame or the cost of their own poor decisions.
Yeah. Well, this has been an excellent overview of that. I got you for a couple more minutes. You're the first ever real economist that I've ever talked to. Do you mind if I ask you just a couple of general questions about economics real quick before we wrap up? So I've been really attracted, obviously, I'm a libertarian, so I've been very attracted to the Austrian school of economics. So, Mises and Hayek and Rothbard. How would you characterize yourself? Because I know that there's a split within the economics profession between the Chicago school, people like Thomas Sowell and Milton Friedman, and then people like Hayek and Mises on the other side. But I've read all of them, and a lot of their ideas seem to be pretty compatible. Is there any real difference between those two groups, or how would you categorize those two?
Well, I was trained and am an enthusiastic devotee of the Austrian School of Economics. My principal professor as an undergraduate was Dr. Hans Senholz at Grove City College, and he was one of four economists to earn their PhDs under Ludwig von Mises.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah, the dean of the Austrian school in the 20th century. So I have always been very partial to that. I think it's the one school of thought that is grounded in the proper methodology, method of studying the economy. And as a result, it usually leads you in right directions and to right conclusions. But I'm also an Austrian who recognizes and appreciates the contributions of other schools of thought. Milton Friedman was not of the Austrian school, but I have enormous respect for him. We disagree on we would disagree if he were alive today on some monetary matters, but that's like saying, hey, among Christians, you have Protestants and Catholics, you have Presbyterians and Methodists, and so on and so forth. We still have a lot of common values. So we can appreciate the contributions each school of theological thought might make. So I'm not a divisive Austrian. I am an ecumenical Austrian who appreciates the other schools of thought. The next one that would have the most in common with the Austrian school might be the Chicago school, not in methodology of studying the economy, but in the ultimate conclusions. Most Chicagoans are rightly and deeply skeptical of interventions by government in the economy, just as Austrians are.
Yeah, and I mean, Thomas Sowell, who I know associates himself with the Chicago School, he was the one that really set me down this path to free market economics. His book, Economic Facts and Fallacies, was a complete worldview changer. Like, I read that book, and it literally changed my life. Like, I just, my perspective on economics was completely changed by that. And I feel now, like reading Hayek and Mises, that they are just taking all of the ideas that he has in his book to their logical conclusion, which I really appreciate about that. The other guy that I want to ask you about, too, because he's such a polarizing figure within libertarian circles, is Murray Rothbard. I've read a lot of his works as well, and I think they're phenomenal. But I know he's really controversial to a lot of people. Do you know why that is? Like, why people struggle with Rothbard's work?
Yeah, in fact, I knew Rothbard before he died in 1995.
That's awesome.
I met him on several occasions and had some conversations with him. And I liked and still like Murray and his writings when it comes to things like the origins of the Great Depression. His work, America's Great Depression, is still phenomenally good, and so many other things that he did. His commitment to liberty is superb. I never quite agreed with him in terms of going so far as embracing no government. I'm closer to our founders in that regard, but I never saw Murray as an enemy in that regard. I always have said to my anarcho-capitalist friends, hey, if we ever get to where we have no more government than I want, I'd be happy to talk about what's left, and you might convince me. But meantime, you're not the enemy. More power to you.
Right.
The enemy is the bad ideas that lead us to concentrate power in the hands of flawed politicians. That's the enemy. But a lot of things about Murray that rub people the wrong way. Sometimes he could be very caustic. Or maybe not very personable in some ways. He may have offended some people personally, but in terms of his scholarship, I mean, it's that was always superb, and the breadth of it, not just in economics but in history as well. He really was a kind of Renaissance man in that regard.
He was, and there's somebody, I forget the name of the organization, but somebody has posted a bunch of his old lectures on Apple Podcast, and I've been listening through some of them, and it is amazing the command of knowledge that he has. Just so much knowledge about so many different fields of thought. I think he was a really impressive intellectual. But I'm with you too. I've read The Anatomy of the State, and I'm going to do a couple of episodes on it here in a few months. I love it, but like you, I still feel like there is at least a limited role for government in some capacity. But I'm open to being convinced.
Yeah.
So
that's where I'm coming from. Yeah.
Yeah. So talk to me about the work that the Foundation of Economic Education does.
Okay, FEE, Foundation for Economic Education, its website is fee.org, is committed to advancing ideas of individual liberty and free markets, private property, personal character, specifically among relative newcomers to these ideas within the age demographic of about 14 to 24. That represents a bit of a narrowing of our focus from FEE's early years, and it's a narrowing that the board and I undertook during the time I was president to decide, hey, where is our niche? Where can we add the greatest value? And we decided a decade ago that would be in this unique demographic, young people, not those who are already committed to freedom. I mean, if somebody comes to us and says, hey, I'm 18 years old, I've read Mises and Rothbard and, and all this and that, I want to come to a fee seminar. We would say, wow, this is great, fantastic, congratulations. We'll help connect you maybe to another group that can take you to the next level, but you're not our audience. We want to be the first portal for newcomers, young people who are hearing these ideas for the first time. We want to provide them in such a way that young people will say, wow, tell me more, and hopefully get hooked on these ideas and grow intellectually from there.
It's great. I read your article for the first time through the Libertarian Christian Institute because I checked their page and I didn't know anything about the Foundation for Economic Education. Fantastic stuff there, though, and I'm going to post links to everything in the show notes here. How can people find, as we wrap up today, how can people find your work in particular? If they want to read your books and read your articles, how can they find out more about you?
Well, for the past maybe 20 years, most of what I have written was written for fee. So it's that stuff is on the fee website. But if you want a concentration of pretty much just my stuff, I have my own website with links to articles I've written, no matter where they have been published. And that website is lawrencewreed.com, LAWRENCE, middle initial W, last name REED.com.
All right, perfect. Well, I know I've already added a bunch of your books to my Amazon wish list, so I'm hoping that a lot of my listeners will do the same.
Okay, thank you.
Hey, well, Larry, again, thank you so much for coming on the show today. I really appreciate it, and have a great day.
Hey, you too, Alex. Anytime. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. If you have any questions or comments or thoughts about the show, please reach out to me at theprotestantlibertarian@gmail.com. You can also follow me on Twitter @ProLibertyPod. Again, you can follow me on Twitter @ProLibertyPod. You can also support the show by leaving a rating or a review on your favorite podcast app. Thank you guys so much for listening, and we'll see you next week.